Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I am very, very excited about this second in our series of African American leaders in the law. I'm very excited because we have a very dynamic panel assembled here, and I also am excited because of the audience we have. Our audience on our webcasts are growing, and we have many those of you in government, in academia, and of course in corporate America. And this time, for the first time, I think we have a good number of law students as well. So I want to welcome everybody, and we're going to go ahead and get right into today's panel. We have three distinguished members, and I'm going to introduce the first one. The first is Jarvis Hollingsworth. Jarvis is general counsel and serves on the executive committee of Kayne Anderson Capital Advisors, an alternative investment management firm focused on energy, infrastructure, real estate, credit, and growth equity. Jarvis also chairs the board of trustees of the Texas Retirement Teachers System of Texas, a $150 billion plus pension trust fund. Jarvis graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he's co-captain of the football team, and he served several years as a captain on active duty, also receiving the Meritorious Service Medal. Our next panelist is Chris Lewis. Chris joined Edward Jones in 2007 as a principal and deputy GC in the legal division, becoming a general counsel of Edward Jones in 2015. As general counsel, Chris is responsible for leading all associates who provide legal support to the firm and for compliance and government relations. Chris also sits on Edward Jones' executive and management committees. He is a member of the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association General Counsel Committee, and his community involvement includes serving as board chair of Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Eastern Missouri. Last but not least, we have Ellie Rodriguez. She is a director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the Law Economic Justice Project. She combats discrimination in employment, healthcare, and economic opportunities on behalf of communities of color, women, and LGBTQ individuals. Before joining the Lawyers Committee in 2016, she worked as an assistant AG in the Civil Rights Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's Office. She currently co-chairs the Employment Task Force of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the national umbrella organization of American civil rights groups. So I want to welcome all the panelists. And before we go to the first question, I want to let everyone know that if you have questions, our plan is to leave about 10 minutes at the end of this webcast for questions. So using the Q&A function on your webcast, you can type in your questions and we will receive the questions and get through as many as we can. All right, so I'm going to pose this first question to the entire panel. Since the killing of George Floyd, our organizations and our society have been challenged with meaningfully addressing racial inequity and advancing social justice. Much of the discussion has been centered on the role of law enforcement. Please relate, each one of you, a personal experience that has shaped your perspective on racial injustice. Ellie, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Jonathan, for having me today. Sadly, my boss, Kristen Clarke, our president and executive director, was unable to make it today. She had a conflict that required her to be on the Hill. So again, thanks for having me. So I'm really excited to speak to your audience. It sounds like it's a great mix, including many students. And I guess the one experience that I would share, I had many growing up in Boston, Massachusetts, but the one that I think was transformative for me was going to Boston Latin School, which is a school in Boston that requires an exam to get in. It's a specialized high school. And I got in as a seventh grader. The school goes from 7th through 12th grade. And when I entered into the school, I was admitted most likely under an affirmative action quota system that had a hard set aside for Latinos and Black students. And my experience there was really interesting because this is a school in the middle of Boston that had a very low percentage of African American and Latino students. And as I rose through the grades, when I was in 10th grade, this was in the early 90s, the affirmative action system was challenged. And ultimately, the quota system was done away with because of a legal battle. And as a result, the number of minority students at the school decreased even further. And it just made me so upset that there was that level of disparity in a public school in the middle of Boston. And I graduated from Boston Latin School in 1999. And these are issues that the school and many other public schools throughout the country are still grappling with, right? How do you ensure equity and access to education? And so my experience growing up in Boston and going to Boston Latin School and seeing the inequity in access to education really inspired me to pursue a career that would allow me to tackle discriminatory systems, that would allow me to empower communities to have equal access to education, to employment. I just never thought of the law as being the path to doing that. And I think that's because there weren't any other attorneys in my family. But when I went to college, I went to NYU for undergrad. I was very fortunate to have two mentors who were just really instrumental in pushing me to pursue a career in the law. They taught me that the law can be used to bring about transformational change, to bring about good. And I followed their advice and I went on to law school. And for the first few years of my career, started out in law firms, practicing employment law on the management side, but eventually found my way to a career in civil rights, which I continue to do today. So really excited to be a part of this panel and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Ellie. Jarvis, you want to take your experience that has shaped your perspective on racial justice?
Sure. And again, Jonathan, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here as part of this esteemed panel. Mine was less about a specific incident and more about a series of incidents and experiences over time. I grew up in the segregated South in a small town called Fayette, Alabama, back in the 60s. Both my parents were teachers, so I grew up in a fairly middle class household. By the time I started school, integration had begun. My oldest two siblings actually graduated from segregated schools. And it was a very difficult period in the small town where I grew up. Race relations, as you might imagine, were very strained. I had older siblings in high school at the time, and every day was difficult. There were race riots, there were fights. Every day was tense. I still have very vivid, memories and images of that period during my life. I was very young, and I didn't quite understand what was happening. It was difficult for me to discern why the white students didn't want me at their school. So as a result, I was taught by my father at a very young age to always carry protection. He always carried a gun and a knife. It was what you did at the time if you were Black and lived in the South to protect yourself. And so as a result of that, it always made me feel like I had something to prove. That the color of my skin didn't define me. It didn't mean I was not as smart. It didn't mean I wasn't as articulate or whatever the issue was for that particular day. It was my motivation. And so that experience defined me and it continues to motivate me today.
Thanks, Jarvis. Chris?
Good afternoon, everyone. And John, echoing what others have said, thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I think similar to Jarvis, it's not one specific experience, and I've thought about how to answer this question a lot. Born in Jamaica in the Caribbean, grew up in upstate New York. and like everyone else, have had my own experiences with prejudice, discrimination, and injustice. But the events of the recent past in our country, with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and others, makes it really visceral and personal, because it reminds me of the often randomness of the experience. And I think what captures it for me is a recent experience with someone that I know. Just a 19-year-old kid, raised by a single mom, did really well in school, was driving home from college because he had the death of a relative. And he was speeding. And a police officer saw him, turned the lights on, and this 19-year-old kid did a typical 19-year-old's knucklehead thing. He turned his lights off and got off at the next exit and sat for a while and then got back onto the highway. When he got back onto the highway, he was pulled over. Now, this is 19 years old, really stupid to do. By the time his family got to me, he'd been indicted and charged with 9 counts, 3 of them felonies, and was looking at something like 10 years in prison. Now, fortunately, we were able to retain lawyers to work with him and work with the prosecutors to get it deferred, and he spent a couple weekends in prison for doing a 19-year-old knucklehead thing. And that brought home very real to me that that kid could have been me, just as George Floyd could have been me. And as you look at the situations, and they're certainly not equal, Mr. Floyd lost his life. But for this 19-year-old kid, the injustice and the prejudice did not allow him to be a kid. And it really visited upon him a perspective that, with objective eyes, we can all say something was wrong there. Yeah. And so just personalizing that for me, I think encapsulates my history. Yeah.
It's a good thing, Chris, he had his family had a friend like you to be there for him. Unfortunately, not everybody does. I'm going to actually turn to the next question, and I'm going to ask you to take the lead on this one, Chris. You know, each one of your organizations, I know, has taken steps to contribute to the advancement of racial justice. Edwin Jones, that you're the general counsel of, Chris, that is headquartered in St. Louis, not far from Ferguson, where, as we all know, in 2014, Michael Brown was killed. But Edwin Jones, for years, has been working to ameliorate some of the underlying issues in its communities, as have the rest of our panelist organizations. Chris, I'd like you to tell us about your experience and what you've learned from doing that might guide some of us on the call today. Do you think, that's part one, and then part two is, do you think we're destined to replay the same cycle of police violence and community reaction again and again?
So the preliminary answer for part two is I hope not. For all of us who believe in equity, equality, and justice, there's certainly been a focus in whatever arena that we play in to, quote, do what we can. And I've been very proud of the intentionality that my colleagues and my firm has shown in trying to address questions of equity and questions of belonging in our firm and in our industry. But as you said, I live in St. Louis, and 6 years ago, I think it was one of the flashpoints for the current moment that we're in. Unlike 6 years ago, this moment feels a little bit different. I can speak to the fact and the reality that in St. Louis, we have seen some positive change through the work of activist groups and lawyers like the Arts City Defenders. There was a really concerted focus on addressing the disparate treatment of poor people and people of color who drive through municipalities, and just surfacing and addressing just a disparate treatment in the debtors' prisons that were effectively created. That was really good work. The Ferguson Commission that sprung up as a result of after the unrest ended came out with some really good, meaningful proposals. After the cameras left, a lot of our community partners really moved in and invested and tried to rebuild Ferguson. And we celebrate that we have the first Black mayor of Ferguson, and Ella Jones, that was announced a couple of weeks ago. So we have seen progress, and we certainly have seen that companies investing can be intentional and can make a difference. But we're also seeing that more needs to be done. I don't know who said it, but it's something I remind myself is that racism never surrenders. You know, it retreats and retrenches, but it never completely goes away. And so as we deal with the things that we're going through today, part of the reality is, as good as the Ferguson Commission recommendations were, not all of them have been carried forward and carried through to action. That while we in St. Louis celebrate the ability for folks to raise their voices and protest, we are also the city that had people point guns at protesters walking past their streets. I do think that we're at a moment that feels different, and I am an optimist, so I don't want to believe that we're in a cycle that is destined to repeat itself, but it is a struggle. And as John Lewis instructed us, a lifelong struggle for all of us. So we must persist and stay vigilant.
Thanks, Chris. Jarvis, you want to jump in on that? And I want to pick up on something Chris said in his comments. He said that this moment feels differently. And so I wonder if you could address that in addition to, you know, do you think we are in a cycle, or is this moment different?
Well, you know, you want to be an optimist about these kinds of things. You know, these aren't the first set of difficult circumstances we've dealt with in this country. And in the past, you know, long after the pain of the tragedy dissipates, you know, in the past, it seems as if our country has gone back to business as usual.
Go to the next question.
You know, this does feel different. You know, I hope I'm right about that. You know, Chris talked about a few things that people are doing. I mean, you know, activists, we're giving money, we're, you know, taking many, many actions. You know, the question is it sustainable? Is it meaningful in the long term? And I think that's what we're all sort of grappling with, how we ensure that this is not just another horrible event that affects us all for a while and then it goes away. Personally, I think it's going to take a concerted effort by all communities. And I think the business community has a larger role to play. I mean, you know, a lot of the systemic racism that we see today, its centrality is in the business community. In creating and benefiting from a system that has ingrained into it several aspects of systemic racism, systemic inequality. And so, you know, I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful. Our firm is doing all that we can, a very active foundation that's actively giving and supporting and spending time in our minority communities. I think it's going to take each of us looking ourselves in the mirror and being honest with ourselves. You know, what is the lens I look through? When I see someone of a different gender, of a different race, I mean, really think about whether what we say and what we believe and value is actually how we live. So, I think holding each of ourselves accountable is a great first step, but I'm very optimistic about it. So.
Thanks, Jarvis. That's good. I really like something Chris said, and then you said. Chris talked about what happens when the cameras go away, and it tied in very much what you're saying about something being sustainable. And I think that's really important as we go forward. Ellie, I'm going to go to the next question. I know you have something on this one, but I'm going to slide to the next question that we have so we don't run out of time. Ronald Serpas, former superintendent of the New Orleans Police Department and a leading voice for criminal justice reform, recently told Law 360, quote, "Many people literally serve a life sentence 3 days at a time. They get arrested, they go to jail, they get some level of mental health or medical care, get out of jail 3 days later, and within 3 days collapse into the same routine. Clearly, big picture issues such as education, incarceration, and unemployment contribute in important ways to racial injustice. Ellie, the Lawyers Committee has a long history of focusing on big issues, as you know, such as barriers to reentry and employment discrimination. In your experience, is it possible to successfully address immediate and long-range issues?
Thanks, Jonathan, for that thoughtful question. And this is a question that I've been thinking about a lot because organizations like ours are really grappling with that issue, right? 2020 has just been so unique in so many different ways. We did not anticipate having a health pandemic that would ravage our communities, both from a health perspective and economically. And the communities that we serve are dealing with these dual crises. And at the same time, we are dealing with this national reckoning that is forcing our country to have a very blunt conversation about systemic racism and discrimination. And so, as you know, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law has been around for decades. It was started by President JFK to leverage the resources from pro bono law firms. And to be honest with you, those resources have been so critical in this moment. When the pandemic first hit, my team and I and others at the organization, we had to press pause and really pivot to the needs that our communities are experiencing right now. And for my project, the Economic Justice Project, that meant really expanding the health equity work that we were doing to push the administration to be more transparent on the COVID data related to tests, cases, and outcomes along lines of race and ethnicity, to do more to protect workers in low-wage jobs that are deemed essential and are experiencing explosions of COVID. And so we started to do work in these areas that, quite frankly, were newer areas for us. But luckily, we saw an outpouring of resources and support from the firms on our board. And we have entire teams from some law firms working on these issues, lending us their brain trust, lending us resources, both financial and in kind, and even sharing with us summer associates. We just had a fantastic summer associate who was with us for a month. And wow, I mean, the work that he contributed to the project was just so impactful and so meaningful and truly made a difference in pushing the work forward. So it's been very inspiring to see law firms really step up to the moment and dedicate their resources to help us in this important fight. And I think it is important to continue to balance both the immediate needs, but to not lose sight of the longer goals, which at the end of the day is to make all of our systems in this country equitable.
Chris, I'm wondering if you could weigh in on this, particularly given your experience in seeing what happened in Ferguson, this notion of the immediate versus long-term, and how can we do both, and how do you do it if you can?
I agree with everything that Ellie said, but what's really poignant about what you quoted with Ronald Serpas is, for a lot of communities, they live day to day. I mean, we have seen unrelenting poverty and the impact of it for Black communities across the country, certainly here in St. Louis. And so the focus on long-term is critically important. But what we're also dealing with is the immediate impact. And what we're seeing, not just with COVID in terms of the health disparities and the impact there, is as we think about schools, and I'm proud, as you've mentioned, to serve as the board chair of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Eastern Missouri. But if you think about schools and access and how we ensure that children don't fall behind, a lot of those families do not have the means or the equipment or even the internet connection in order to go to school virtually. And so we also know that a lot of those young children, their primary way of having a healthy meal was through school programs. And so it's been really encouraging to see a lot of nonprofits, a lot of community groups come together to try to bridge that gap and to meet the needs. But the 3-day cycle is real. And for these families, how do you help them that their children do not suffer the long-term impacts of falling so far behind school because they can't attend in a virtual classroom as some other children can? How do we ensure that folks are able to eat? How do we ensure that we don't have mass evictions and displacements of people? So I think that lawyers play a critical role, as Ellie kind of laid out. There's a lot of work to do aligned to all of our long-term goals, but there's some really immediate crises that we need to attend to as well.
You know, Jarvis, I'm going to go to the next question. I know you'd probably like to chime in, but it ties in with something Chris was saying and answering about, you know, things that are short term that need to be done immediately and some things that are longer term. And I want to talk to you about wealth inequity. Wealth inequity is one of the systemic issues. You mentioned systemic issues in corporate America, Jarvis, earlier. But it's one of the systemic issues widely discussed in books such as The Color of Money. George Floyd was murdered in a majority-minority neighborhood in South Minneapolis, which is in the New Deal era labeled hazardous or a hazardous zone because it was, quote, majority colored. White neighborhoods were green and black neighborhoods were red, and the red neighborhoods could not qualify for Federal Housing Administration mortgage guarantees, which was the biggest wealth building subsidy of the century. White families today have a median net worth 10 times that of black families, $170,000 compared to about $17,000. Jarvis, I'd like you to talk about this wealth gap and how it contributes to racial injustice.
Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate you assigning me such a heavy question. So, I figured that if I was going to be credible on this question, as I was preparing for the panel, I thought I might need to do a little research so I could have some support from some of this empirical data. I mean, I'll start with the general premise that we've all heard over and over that, we're never going to be able to achieve social justice without achieving economic justice. This 10 times multiple statement that you made, as you know, that's from a 2016 McKinsey study regarding the wealth of white families versus, that of black families. The New York Times did a recent study on this issue and concluded incredibly that the black-white wage gap is actually roughly as large today as it was in 1950. So think about how remarkable that is. That despite decades of political change, the end of enforced segregation across the South, the passage of multiple civil rights bills, the implementation of affirmative action policies, even the election of a black president, that what black men earn versus their white counterparts is the same as it was when Harry Truman was president. Of course, there's many reasons for this. As the study cites, there's fewer black men in the workforce. There's vastly more black men incarcerated, twice as high as Hispanic men, 6 times higher than white men. The blue collar jobs, those decent paying blue collar jobs, are also shrinking. Now, the wage gap did improve from 1950 to 1980, according to this study. Civil rights laws were enacted, the decline in legally sanctionalized racism, those all played a role. We had stronger unions, we had an increased minimum wage. But since 1980, the wage gap has increased again, because most of those things that I just talked about have been reversed. The minimum wage has decreased, unions have shrunk, tax rates on the wealthy, of course, are fallen as compared to the bottom half of earners. And as we know, black workers are disproportionately in these lower income groups. One thing you mentioned, Jonathan, was housing, which I think is a very interesting thing to look at. You talked about the redlining, and it's the part of America where I think there's still lingering effects of past racist actions are still clear today. Housing policy has affected, as you indicated, the disparate accumulation of wealth in America. FHA policies, the VHA policies, those stimulus and federal benefits that dumped millions of dollars into programs to build homes in suburbs and et cetera, those programs were denied to Black Americans. And therefore, the white population was able to develop significant generational wealth while Black families weren't able to do so. So for decades, government policies have explicitly helped white families build capital, build wealth, and denied Black Americans the same opportunity. And as we know, that's also resulted in Black Americans living in less prosperous neighborhoods with less capital, which also means lower quality schools. So absolutely, this disparate ability to build wealth has had a much lingering systemic effect.
Jarvis, thank you for that answer. And Chris, I'm going to do something a little unfair here before we go to this next question. It wouldn't be, we've got Jarvis with this Kayne Capital financial advisor, fantastic private equity, and then you obviously with Edward Jones. I'm just wondering if you could give a little insight. We've got a lot of different financial institutions on the line here for this webcast. And if Chris Lewis was running the world, what would you do? What step would you take to kind of try to bridge this this gap?
If I had the answer, I'd be doing something different with my life, right? But as I think about your question and some of what Jarvis talked about, it brings back to life for me why this moment feels different. A lot of the issues are structural, and it's not about what is in someone's heart. It's about recognizing, well, let me be clear, that does matter too, but recognizing that we are living with a system that structurally yields a result that we would have thought 70 years later would be different. And so how do we focus on dismantling that structure, building a new one? I do think that part of it is reaching common understanding, which we've seen happen all across the country over the past several weeks, with people having courageous conversations or whatever it is, just to understand what the problem is. Racism and racists are a problem. But the heart of what we're talking about now is a structure of our society and communities that yields different results for different people. And getting everyone to understand that structural aspect of it is the work that we need to do, I think is really important. I, like Jarvis, work in financial services. We know that we have a particular role to play in access to wealth building, financial education. There's a lot more that our industry can do, and folks have said we are ready, willing, and able to do. But it is really hard work that will take a long time and requires commitment and perseverance towards it. What Jarvis said, and I read that article, Jarvis, we are no further along than we were 70 years ago. That speaks to something much more profound than an individual police officer. There's work that we need to do.
Well said, Chris. Ellie, I'm going to turn this next question, ask you to start it off. In a recent Atlantic article entitled "The False Promise of Anti-Racism Books," Professor Sadie Grundy discusses why what we do is far more important than what we read in a cultural movement such as this. She said, quote, "In the absence of concrete economic and legislative changes, consciousness erasing through anti-racist reading is mere filibustering." I'd like you to answer this question, Ellie. What concrete actions should inside and outside counsel focus on together to accelerate concrete progress in racial justice?
So I tend to agree with Professor Grundy that this moment absolutely requires more than doing your required anti-racism and ally reading. It requires concrete action. It requires deliberation. It requires intentionality. And we need to see that from all of the sectors. As Jarvis said, I think businesses play a huge role. Rolling out an implicit bias training alone probably won't be enough to meet the moment and the structural challenges that we face that Chris was talking about. We need much more than just a single training. And I started my career working for management side law firms and understand how those environments work, understand how, as an underrepresented person in working in that environment, it can be a very difficult space to navigate. And so I think that this moment really calls for action across the board. One thing that I've found to be interesting in this moment is that this hasn't been a moment just about police brutality in the wake of George Floyd's killing. It's also resulted in increased transparency for businesses. There's been a movement called Pull Up or Shut Up. I don't know if you've seen this on Instagram, but there is a Black woman CEO, Sharon Shooter, who has been pressing on businesses in all sectors to release their diversity numbers, not only for their overall workforce, but also for their executive management positions and for board positions. And I've been an employment attorney for quite some time, doing affirmative action work, doing EEO work. And this is the first time that I've seen that sort of call to action for businesses. And so I tend to agree with Chris and Jarvis that this moment feels different. And I think it's really up to us to leverage this moment and to push for change that is as transformational as possible. And so what does that mean for in-house counsel, for outside counsel? For outside counsel, I think that there's a real obligation, and I know a lot of businesses are already doing this, to look internally, right? What are your hiring practices? What are your promotional practices? It's one thing to recruit the rock star, but what are you going to do to keep them there, to make sure that they're paid equitably, to ensure that they are being treated fairly. And for in-house counsel, of course, there are a lot of things that they can do as well to ensure that there is diversity in the sector, but also that they are calling on outside counsel to ensure that the teams that are working on their matters are diverse, that the leaders on their matters are diverse. And so I think that there's a lot that we can do across sectors. I'm encouraged by the calls to action that I've seen, not only for systems like our criminal justice system, but also for businesses as well.
Very good. You know, I know Chris and Jarvis, both in-house and out-house, you all have, I shouldn't say out-house, but being in counsel and being outside counsel, you all have dealt with, working, partnering with clients and law firms. I'm wondering if you might give just a short answer for the sake of time to the question. What concrete things did the two of you think we should be doing in partnership, law firms and companies?
Really briefly, invest in diverse associates for the long term. Recognizing the economics of law firms are what they are. Relationships take time to build. Expertise take time to build. We, like other firms, are committed to not just diversity within the team, but diversity in the people who do our work, and demonstrated commitment to diversity with the law firms that we partner with. Invest over time in talented, diverse associates and let them do our work.
Jarvis?
Yeah, same here. Like Chris, it's an emphasis for me as a general counsel. It's these types of goals are specifically mentioned in the engagement letters with the law firms that do our work at Kayne Anderson in terms of what our expectation is with respect to diverse teams. The other thing I'll say, having spent, almost 30 years of my practice in large law firms, is, to just echo something that Dariella said, recruiting is not enough. Sometimes law firms are environments where associates of color get lost, and it's not always intentional. We do business with, we support, we socialize with people who we like, with people who, we have things in common with. And sometimes that associate of color just gets lost in the morass that's a big law firm. Tracking their production, tracking the development of their skill set. These are all critical, ongoing tasks so that your retention and your promotion actually works, so that when that associate of color is up for partner, that they've achieved all the skills they need. They've thought about their financial profile and what it looks like and what that needs to be promoted to partner. And so having processes in place so that as associates in general mature through the law firm process, that they're meeting all of those hurdles at each level. They've done all the things within their practice group for them to be considered successful lawyers at the time they're being considered. So being intentional about processing, monitoring that progression, I think is a big, big factor, at least something that I focused on when I was a law firm partner.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm told here by my fantastic tech guy, Dave Lance, we've got questions. So I'm going to jump, for the sake of time, to our last question, and then we're going to field some of the questions from the audience. And I'm going to start with you, Chris, on this question, and then we can go from there. If there was a single piece of advice you could give to leaders in the legal community about talking to employees and other stakeholders about racial injustice and encouraging them to contribute to achieve positive, lasting change, what would that advice be?
Enter into the conversation with curiosity and openness, and listen to the lived experience of the people that you are working with. And I think doing that opens up the possibilities that can be co-created for a successful path and career for those young people. It is not one size fits all in any profession, least of all ours. And as young leaders, the obligation to nurture talent and develop talent starts with listening and understanding where people are coming from. So that's where I would start.
Thanks, Chris. Ellie?
I agree with what Chris said, and I guess I would add that businesses should not be afraid to have these conversations. I think sometimes there's a reluctance to talk very clearly about structural racism because of the fear of backlash. And as Chris said, I think if we want to move forward, we need to have these difficult conversations. But it doesn't begin and end with the conversation. Businesses and organizations and law firms, they have to dedicate resources to those diversity and inclusion goals. They have to develop long-term plans, short-term plans, and they need to ensure that the resources are supporting a person or a team that actually has the authority to effectuate real and lasting change. That work should not fall on the shoulders on the employees of color within the organization. That work should really be independently supported to ensure that it lasts.
Very good. Jarvis, I'm gonna turn to the questions now. I know you probably like to answer that question, but the first question we have here is actually addressed to you. So I'm gonna start there, and then we're gonna work through as many of these questions as we can. It says, Mr. Hollingsworth, you've been associated with numerous public and private institutions in your career, including the State Bar of Texas, the University of Houston system, and a major Texas law firm. Talk about the challenges of addressing institutional behavior that drives racial inequity, and how can we work to identify and address issues in our own organizations?
I think these times that we're in require extraordinary efforts. Someone much smarter than me have said that we need to get comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. And I think that, a part of that dialogue, requires a few things. I think we've got to be intentional. I think we've got to be authentic. And I think the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that systemic racism does in fact exist in each of our organizations. And I think Chris implied this. It doesn't make you a racist. We're not saying you're a racist. We're saying that there are policies and procedures that are built into our systems that have driven certain outcomes that in the end have less than equitable consequences for some people. And so I think the first acknowledgement is that systemic racism does exist. It is in my organization. And the real question is, how am I going to put things in place so that we're intentional, that we're authentic, that we actually listen to each other? We try to view those perspectives in the lens from which they're coming. And I think it starts at the very top of each organization. We've got to require it. We've got to enforce it. We've got to make partners accountable for it. And I think only then will we see meaningful, sustainable change.
Thanks, Jarvis. So I'm next question from somebody is directed towards you, Ellie. And here's the question. You've been involved in a lot of different types of litigation, employment, and other impact litigation with the Lawyers Committee and New York State Attorney General's office. In your experience, how effective is litigation in addressing and redressing racial and other social inequities?
That's a really great question. And as you know, litigation can oftentimes take many, many years. It was a really unique and wonderful experience to be able to work at the New York Attorney General's office in the Civil Rights Bureau, because as affirmative civil rights prosecutors, we had significant subpoena power to cut subpoenas when we suspected that there was a pattern or practice of discrimination happening, and to be able to sort of short circuit the discovery process to really understand whether or not there was evidence of discrimination. And oftentimes that evidence, if it existed, helps to come to an agreement. And those agreements would cover constituents throughout the state of New York, right? So in the 4 years that I was there, I was able to do very impactful work with my phenomenal colleagues along the lines of race, ethnicity, gender, work that protected nursing mothers and other issues, work to advance language access, et cetera. And so my experience at the Lawyers Committee has been somewhat different, because we do engage in impact litigation. And I do have some cases that, you know, are many years old. And sometimes the wheels of justice can grind very slowly. But what we've learned is that there is power in using multi-pronged approaches, combining litigation with policy advocacy, with pushing for legislative reform, with pushing for regulatory reform. And those other tools have been very important, particularly under this administration, where we have seen so many rollbacks to civil rights. And so I think that at the end of the day, we have to remain flexible and use the various tools in our toolbox to respond to the moment as effectively as possible.
Okay. We've got a lot of questions. I don't know if we're going to get through them all before 4, but let me get to the next question that's addressed to all of you all. Can you slide down a little bit, David, please? I can't. A little more. I mean, next. Yeah, keep going down. I want to go to the next one. That's for all of them. Yeah, there we go. Question. I've really enjoyed the panel discussion. The panelists have been outstanding. I'm wondering, from their perspective, since the Black Lives Matter movement, have there been changes within your organizations as a result of George Floyd's killing?
So I'll start. I'll say yes, there have, and we've been very public with our commitments. But to Ellie's sage advice earlier, judge us by our actions and hold us and each other accountable for the commitments that we have made. The commitments that, not just from my firm, but from others, are very real for the folks making them. But we need to be judged by action. Now is not the time for talk. And we need to adhere to accountability for delivering on the commitments that we have publicly made.
Yes, Jarvis, and I'll say the same thing for Kayne Anderson. We have made some changes more recently. One of the ones we've spent more time on is really trying to educate our employee base about racial inequity and the experiences that different people of different backgrounds and ethnicities experience. So we've been having, of course, we're virtual, but we have a town hall each Friday where everyone in the firm is on the phone. And we've had speakers come in, and speakers who have been very willing to talk, much like we have today, I think the panelists have, about their personal experiences, providing information and background that some people on the phone may not realize ever happens. And so just to enlighten and, bring some perspective to the fact that, there are Black and brown people and women, of course, as well, and others who experience this kind of racism that many of our listeners have never faced. And to give them that real perspective that it happens, that it's real, people are impacted by it, and it's a serious issue that we have to deal with. And it has really been very, very meaningful, very meaningful.
I'm going to get another question in. David, what time is it?
3:57.
Okay, I'm going to get another question in, and I want you, Ellie, to take the first stab at this one. One member of the audience wrote, "What are the two key areas that would make the most long-term change? A, getting rid of de facto redlining. B, better schools in poor neighborhoods, or something else?"
Oh, man. Great question. And I think both of those issues are equally as important. In our organization, we understand that all of these issues are deeply interconnected. We do work on voting rights and access to the polls, to the booths. We do work on criminal justice reform. We do work to increase access to employment. We do work to combat consumer discrimination. We do work to increase access to education. We do work on the fair housing front to combat redlining. And as I mentioned earlier, under this administration, we have seen so many attacks across the board in all of the areas in which we do work. And if we do see a change in administration, we are going to have a lot of work to do to repair the damage that has been done these past 4 years. And so I don't think I would pick one or two areas, but I do think that it is increasingly important to work in coalition with partners across disciplines to ensure that we're working as strategically and smartly as possible.
All right, I want to pose one more question to all of you, given that we have a large number of law students on the webcast. And here's the question. What advice, given your many years of experience in corporations and large law firms and in public interest, what advice would you give to a young African-American lawyer coming out of law school who wants to make a difference? And I'm going to start with you, Chris.
Be a pioneer and persist. Don't be afraid to go to areas of the law that are foreign to you, and do not retreat when things get hard. It pays off in the end. It takes a long time, but do persist.
Jarvis?
I'd piggyback on just one aspect of what Chris said, and that is, be persistent. In any sector, in any profession, there's going to be challenges, but take responsibility for your own career. Be aggressive, be proactive, be persistent, press the people that you work with and for fair treatment and for good assignments, and to work on the big projects. Take responsibility for the success of your own career.
Ellie, I'm going to conclude with you. What advice would you give?
Well, I guess I have to acknowledge the economic situation that we're in. I just read a Law 360 article that said in 2019, 90% of law graduates were able to secure a job. I don't know what the numbers are going to look like for this year, but I imagine that they're not going to look that good. And so I agree with Chris and Jarvis. This moment requires perseverance. It requires creativity. It requires being flexible. It requires being open-minded. And I am someone who went to law school with the explicit goal of wanting to do civil rights and racial justice work. I did not get that opportunity right after I graduated. And it just required me to think longer term, to think about, okay, this is where I want to end up. How can I get there? What will lead me there? And with persistence, I was able to get there. So, but not without the guidance of mentors at every step of the way. So do not be afraid to seek out the guidance of mentors who have supported you up until now. You will meet new mentors as you pursue new opportunities. And at every opportunity that you have, just really shine. You have gotten this far. You are incredibly talented. You have a lot to offer. And so I have no doubt that all the students that have joined us today will make really amazing and impactful differences. And I look forward to seeing everything that they have to offer.
That's great. Well, I want to, and I apologize, we're a little bit beyond the time, and if we took all the questions, we'd go much longer. But I just want to thank Ellie, Chris, and Jarvis for just being a fantastic panel. I know the audience really, by the number of questions we have here for this group, really appreciated y'all. And from McGuireWoods, I just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be a voice on a very important issue at a very important time. So thank you. And for those who are listening on the webcast and watching, we're going to have our next installment on the series of African American leaders in the law in early September. And it's our intention to actually have 2 different webcasts in September, so be looking for those invites. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you for our panelists, and we'll see you next time.